In 1991, one of the two global superpowers imploded. Here's how the Soviet Union fell apart in just 10 minutes. By the end of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were the dominant global superpowers. By the 1980s, however, cracks were beginning to show in the facade of Soviet strength. Under the surface, the USSR was experiencing severe economic stagnation, rampant political corruption, and growing popular discontent. At the same time, the Soviet military's disastrous war in Afghanistan revealed fundamental weaknesses in the system. And this was happening at a time when the Cold War with the United States was increasingly draining Soviet resources. And now we find ourselves in 1991, when reform-minded Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev attempted to introduce political and economic reforms to the stagnant system. But his efforts backfired, causing the very fabric of Soviet society to unravel, and ultimately leading to the collapse of the USSR just a few months later. And if you'd like to better understand global politics, then be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss the upcoming episode where we will explore how the Soviet Union went from being a global superpower to a crumbling dictatorship. So, let's get started. Before we dive into the events of 1991, we need to take a step back and discuss the roots of the Soviet crisis. Though the USSR would technically survive until 1991, the Soviet Union had been effectively finished since 1986, which is when the Chernobyl nuclear disaster exposed the inefficiency and corruption of the centralized planning system. In reality, Soviet leaders had been aware of this problem for decades, and they knew that something needed to change. However, powerful interest groups benefited from the status quo and resisted any meaningful reform. As a result, the Soviet economy experienced prolonged stagnation throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, which caused material living standards to stagnate and created a chronic shortage of consumer goods. So people would often find themselves waiting in long lines or queues outside stores for basic necessities or even food. This phenomenon became known derisively as the Soviet equivalent of McDonald's, because there was such a chronic shortage of restaurants. The Soviet leadership's response was to further restrict access to consumer goods and to impose tight rationing. Naturally, this exacerbated the situation and led to mass black markets. For example, a Russian historian recently revealed that he witnessed firsthand how his mother used to have to wait in line for up to 10 hours to buy a can of dog food while she was taking care of their family's dog during the Brezhnev era. At the same time, the arms race with the United States was putting enormous financial strain on the Soviet economy. The USSR spent hundreds of billions of dollars on the military, which is believed to have contributed significantly to the economic crisis. And so, by the time that Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, the Soviet Union was already on the verge of collapse. Upon assuming office, Gorbachev introduced sweeping reforms intended to revitalize the stagnant Soviet system. His first major reform was Glasnost, or openness. Glasnost referred to a newfound freedom of speech, of the press, and of artistic expression. It also meant that citizens were allowed to criticize the government and the Communist Party, something which was unheard of under previous Soviet leaders. To an extent, this policy succeeded in improving Soviet society, but it also backfired. Soon, Glasnost had unleashed forces that were beyond Gorbachev's control. For example, as Soviet dissidents gained a voice, they began denouncing the Soviet regime's human rights abuses and calling for democratic reforms. Suddenly, the government was being held accountable in the court of public opinion. At the same time, ethnic and nationalist tensions that had been suppressed under the Tsars and the Communists were starting to resurface. Gorbachev's second major reform was Perestroika, or restructuring. Perestroika aimed to decentralize parts of the Soviet economy and to introduce limited private enterprise, which was illegal under the communist system. While these reforms did allow small businesses to emerge, they weren't nearly as comprehensive as the shock therapy reforms that we see in post-Soviet Russia or in former communist states like Poland and Romania. And because they were introduced so slowly, They failed to address the root causes of the economic crisis, and thus they failed to prevent the collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, by introducing these reforms, Gorbachev inadvertently accelerated the demise of communism in the USSR, and this brings us to the year 1991. In March 1991, Lithuania became the first Soviet republic to declare independence, followed shortly thereafter by Latvia and Estonia. But it was the August coup attempt that would prove to be the death knell of the Soviet Union. The plotters were hardline communists who opposed Gorbachev's reforms. They believed that the Soviet system was in danger of complete collapse and that the reforms were to blame. And so they decided to overthrow the government and to restore Soviet communism under a new hardline leader. But here's where things get complicated. Because while it was certainly true that the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse, it wasn't actually clear whether or not Gorbachev's reforms were to blame. In fact, many historians today argue that the Soviet Union was already essentially finished after the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, and that Gorbachev's reforms actually only sped up the process, but that's neither here nor there because the hardliners didn't know this. And so on August 19, 1991, they detained Gorbachev and effectively overthrew the government. They then installed a hardline communist named Yanaev as the new leader of the Soviet Union. However, the coup attempt backfired. While hardline loyalists did exist within the Soviet Union, they were nowhere near powerful enough to actually carry out a successful coup. The key to the failure of the coup was that the vast majority of Soviets either supported or at least condoned Gorbachev's reforms. In fact, many of them wanted even more drastic reforms. This was especially true among the younger generation, which viewed the Soviet Union as backward, corrupt, and thoroughly discredited. And nowhere was opposition to the coup more fervent than in Moscow, where popular Russian leader Boris Yeltsin galvanized the crowds against the coup leaders. And so after just 72 hours, the coup was over. Yeltsin emerged as the hero of the moment. He subsequently assumed the presidency of the Russian Republic, and he wasted no time in denouncing the old Soviet system. And here's the thing. The coup attempt actually saved the life of Mikhail Gorbachev, who was placed under protective custody after the plotters failed. But it shattered the last remains of Soviet authority. Now that it was obvious that there was absolutely no way that they could restore Soviet communism, the Baltic states, along with Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and many other republics, declared independence from the crumbling Soviet Union. On December, all 15 of the Soviet republics had declared independence, and 3 days later, on December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. At 8:31 p.m., he appeared on national television to announce his resignation. He said, "Today, the existence of the Soviet Union has terminated. Comrades, I am ending my work as the President of the Soviet Union. I hereby transmit my powers to the Russian Federation. The time has come for us to put an end to this. Let us live in the truth. Let the future belong to those who are capable of living in the truth and creating a better life for all our people. Goodbye." The red Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, and thus the world's longest and largest communist empire came to an end. In its place, we got 15 independent nations, including the Russian Federation, the world's largest country by landmass and the successor state to the USSR. Meanwhile, the Cold War had officially come to an end. There is much more to say about what happened next in Russia and the former Soviet states. So stay tuned so that you don't miss the next episode, where we will explore how Russia transitioned from communism to capitalism in the chaotic 1990s. If you want to learn more about the history of Russia and the Soviet Union, then check out the series in the description below. We cover everything from Peter the Great to Putin. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you want me to keep making these videos. And thanks to my patrons for supporting this channel. If you'd like to support this channel, then become a patron today. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you next time.